Today we hear the story of Good Friday, continuing from where we left off yesterday. Yesterday we left Peter devastated because not only had he deserted his friend Jesus, but he denied him 3 times before the cock crowed. We left Jesus with the soldiers, with their swords, having taken Jesus from the Garden of Gethsemane. And now we find Jesus in front of the chief priests, the scribes, the elders, the whole council of the temple. They all surround him and they start to ask him questions. They ask him questions as we heard, and they then say, we can't do anything with this. We can't do anything with this man. We're going to take him to Pilate. So they move, and Jesus is taken before Pilate. They take him to Pilate. Pilate really doesn't want to be bothered with all this nonsense. Pilate would rather be doing other things, but he knows that his position here is really, really difficult, because if he's sympathetic to Jesus, he upsets the temple authorities. If he isn't sympathetic if he's sympathetic to the authorities, he upsets Jesus and his followers. So Pilate knows he's in a difficult position, and he has to tread carefully to prevent there being civil unrest. So Pilate says to Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus replies, "You say so." Pilate doesn't really understand that as an answer, and he says, "Have you no answer?" And Jesus, who's trusting in his call, who's trusting in what he knows he should do, Jesus doesn't reply. Pilate is amazed that he doesn't reply. So what Pilate does to try and get out of a situation that makes him look to varying people, either good or bad, he goes out to the Passover crowd and he speaks to the Passover crowd and he says, "Every year we release a prisoner for the festival. Who do you want me to release? Do you want me to release the King of the Jews?" Now, the chief priests and the elders and the scribes were really anxious that Jesus of Nazareth should not be released, that Jesus of Nazareth needed to be got rid of. He needed to be taken out of the equation, because then all of this unrest among the people, all of this would go. So they infiltrated the crowd, and as Pilate said, "Do you want me to release Jesus of Nazareth?" they shouted, "Release Jesus Barabbas." Barabbas was a well-known a thief and a bandit and an all-round not-so-good guy. But they started the shouting, "Release Barabbas, release Barabbas, release Barabbas." This quite perturbed Pilate. But he kind of had to do as the crowd said. So he said, "What do you want me to do with the King of the Jews?" And the chief priests and the scribes incited the crowd to say, "Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him." And you know what it's like when a big crowd gets together? And we saw this on Palm Sunday. The big crowd had joy, and the joy spread. Well, the same sort of thing can happen in the negative way when crowds get together and everybody got whipped up and they'd crucify him, crucify him. And Pilate had no choice. He couldn't release Jesus. He had to release Barabbas. So what he said then was, "Hand him over to the authorities. He's nothing to do with me anymore." And in some of the stories we hear that Pilate washed his hands, which said, "I don't want anything to do with this anymore. This is your problem. This is you to deal with it. Off you go." So Jesus was taken back by the soldiers, and he was whipped and he was beaten. And they mocked him, and they called him the King of the Jews. And Jesus was given a cross to carry. He was given a cross to carry, and he was being taken out of the city, so he still had the soldiers with him. By this point, Jesus was exhausted. He'd been beaten, he'd been hurt, he'd been ridiculed, all of the things that had happened before with him, with his disciples. He was exhausted and almost broken. But they took him outside the walls of the city, and there they were to crucify him. There was a man called Simon of Cyrene, and on the way Jesus kept falling and was just in such a state that the soldiers asked Simon of Cyrene to carry his cross, and so he bore the cross to the top of the hill, to Golgotha, a place outside the city where Jesus was to be crucified. Now for us it's really horrible to think of somebody being put on a cross to die, but this was the punishment of the time. If you did things that the authorities didn't like, if you broke the laws, if you broke the Roman laws, this was what happened. And crucifixion was something that happened to ordinary people. So what we're seeing here is Jesus receiving the same treatment as an ordinary person, and yet we know he was so much more. The other thing that we have to remember in this is, actually, had Jesus done the things like a thief or a bandit? Had he broken laws? Well, to the Jewish people the Jewish authorities, he had broken. He'd broken the law, the Jewish law. He'd healed people on the Sabbath. He'd eaten with all sorts of different people. He hadn't stuck to the rules that were expected. But actually, he hadn't done anything that massively wrong. What he'd done is he'd come to show God's love to the whole world, to show that God's way is a different way to the way that the world is. And because of that, he was to be crucified. So at 9 o'clock, on the morning of the day we call Good Friday, Jesus was crucified on the cross. People would watch such things. We can't even imagine it now, but people would watch such things. And at 9 o'clock, he was put on the cross, and still people teased him. Still people mocked him. Call yourself the King of the Jews. Get yourself off the cross now. It was so hard, but Jesus was prepared to do what God had required of him. And he hung on the cross. And as the story goes, at 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out some words saying, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? At that moment, Jesus felt completely alone. One of the soldiers at this point looked at Jesus and realized what he'd done and said, this man was truly the Son of God. Gradually, people began to realize that something huge was happening. And as Jesus said his final words, he died. And people on the cross were allowed to be taken down from the cross and buried. And Jesus died on a Friday, which in in the life of the Jews is a special day. The Sabbath starts on a Friday evening as it gets dark and goes on until Saturday evening. It was really important that if Jesus was going to be taken off the cross, he was going to have that happen to him before it got dark. So a man called Joseph of Arimathea went to Pilate. This was a really brave man. He went to Pilate and he said, Pilate, may I take the body of Jesus and put it in a tomb? This was really brave because Jesus had upset a lot of people. Jesus had caused a lot of problems, and this man dared to go to Pilate. Pilate by this point had also begun to realise what a big mistake he'd made, and he said, take the body, do what you want to do. So Joseph of Arimathea took the body of Jesus and he put it in a tomb. And soldiers guarded the tomb. And as far as we know, that's the end of the story. Well, it is the end of the story for Good Friday. But there is more to come. And we who know the end of the story know that it is good stuff to come on this Good Friday, when everything, for those who were there, felt totally desolate.